1857, Portugal, the village where no one spoke again. When I was a boy, the mornings came with the smell of wood smoke and the sea. The sun rose slowly over the ridge where the cork oaks wore their pale, peeling coats, and our village, tucked between the terraces of vines and the breathing salt of the Atlantic, awoke in a chorus of roosters and the rasping wheels of hand-carts. The first hands to rouse the day were my mother's as she kneaded dough, turning it with the practiced rhythm she said came from her own mother, and her mother before that. The second were my father's, striking the plane across a board to smooth the ribs of a boat he was repairing. The third were mine, chafed and impatient as only a boy's hands can be, eager to fetch, to run, to see what the daylight would bring. We called our village Vale des Ambroise, the Valley of Junipers, though it was really a scatter of whitewashed cottages clinging to the curve of a hillside, with blue-painted doors that matched the azulejo tiles of saints fixed into our walls. If you climbed to the small chapel of São Miguel at the top, as I did often enough, you could see the slate-green sea like a single open eye, and beyond it, the pale blur where the sky began. On days when the wind came from the west, the church bell sounded tinny and far. On other mornings, when the wind lay down and the clouds moved like sheep, the sound was round and warm and close. It never failed to find us at the fountain in the square. The fountain was not grand, but it was ours. It had been set into the wall of the old olive press at some time no one remembered, and a carved stone face poured water into a trough. The face might have been Roman, some said, or one of the forgotten gods, though Padre Sebastião scoffed at that. The truth was, when the sun struck the sheen on the water and the fountain spoke its small song, it felt older than any of us and kinder than whatever power lay beyond the chapel's door. We called it the Font das Palavras, the fountain of words. Standing at its ledge and hearing the water, many of us felt we could hear for a moment, if we listened as carefully as my grandmother Celeste taught us to listen, the unspoken wishes of our neighbors, the gossip a mouth dared not say, the prayer that trembled too hard to leave the heart. Sometimes when the bucket chain rattled, and the water hushed just so, the splash became syllables. Or so we said. Or so we wanted to believe. I tell you, Tomasz, my grandmother would say, her voice the husk of an almond, that fountain knows secrets. It will betray you only if you betray yourself. Remember this. She had a way of fixing me with a look that felt like a blessing and a warning at once. And never take more than you need. At 13, I took her words to heart, though I never quite understood them. The truth was that I loved words too much to trust them. They flew from my mouth before I could catch them, and I spent many afternoons fishing them back, having to apologize to my mother or to the older women who sat at the fountain with their shawls and their baskets of green beans. Oh, Tomasz, they would laugh, not unkindly, your tongue runs faster than your feet. My father, Matthias, was lean and measured by nature. He repaired boats for the fishermen who worked the river mouth where it married the sea. He was not a fisherman himself. He said that the sea was a beautiful bride with a willful heart, who liked to take what she loved back into herself. He loved my mother, Anna, the way he loved wood, quietly, with patience. He would lean against the lintel of our door with his arms dusted in sawdust and watch her knead and never speak, though sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he would smile in that soft way of his that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. Our house was a simple, single-story affair with a low beam that always knocked my head until I learned to duck, and a stone floor that held the night school even in August. My sister, Ines, younger by 3 years, had hair the color of chestnut and a laugh that felt like a sparrow's flutter. She was careful where I was careless, and when I had scraped knees she would scold me with a gravity that seemed too big for her small hands, then blow gently on the bruises as if her breath could smooth the hurt away. On an ordinary day, I would be up with the sun, my feet slipping into the worn spots where my feet had always fit in the leather of my shoes. I would run the short distance to the fountain with the iron-banded bucket, nodding to Senor Marcus, our regdor, who liked to lean on his cane by the fountain and watch the village as if it belonged to him. He would sometimes rattle a paper from his pocket and say, "News from Porto, lad. Cars that run without horses, imagine." Then he would laugh at his own joke, for the carriage that moved without horses, what we had heard called a train in the cities, was a rumor that traveled faster than any mule. "Good morning, senor," I would reply, and because my grandmother had taught me to be polite, I would listen to whatever he wanted to say about taxes or deliveries or the price of salt cod in the market. My mind would be running elsewhere, to the riverbank, where Miguel, my closest friend, might already be skipping stones, to the olive groves, where the ground smelled of warm oil and earth, to the schoolroom where Mestre Alvaro would set us Latin declensions and smile when he saw my ink-spattered nose. "Mind your tongue," my grandmother would say when I returned with the water and sat to peel potatoes. "A word is a pebble in a shoe, little to look at, but it can make you limp all day." She said many such things, and I remember them more clearly than any Latin. She told me once that when she was a girl, she had gone with her own mother on a romaria, a pilgrimage up the valley to the shrine of Nossa Senhora do Monte, and how the women had walked with their shawls over their heads and their mouths closed, letting their silence carry their prayers ahead of them. "We did not need to speak," she said, "for God hears the weight of our feet. He hears the breath between what we say. If we are very quiet, Tomasz, we can hear one another that way, too." I did not laugh. Though I was often foolish, I was not foolish about her. There are certain elders who seem to carry the hush of old trees with them, and my grandmother was one of those. When she died, many years later, I would think of this, and it would be both comfort and ache. But then, in the year I am telling you about, 1857, the year the swallows nested low, the old year had passed, and we were a small village, living our small lives with the dignity and the burdens such lives always hold. From the main road, little more than a wide track lined with stone walls, you could climb up to our chapel of São Miguel or down the gentle slope toward the river. The olive press, where the oil master, Senor Fialho, worked with a face like a dry fig, sat on the lower edge, its thick wooden beam a giant's arm poised over stone wheels. In harvest season, the smell there was rich and dark, and my mother said that if they set the press at the end of the day, she could smell the oil in her dreams. Beside it, the square was not much more than the fountain and a few benches under a plane tree. Still, to us, it was a world. Our schoolhouse stood opposite the olive press, one high room with a slate at the front and rows of benches polished by generations of fidgeting. There we learned to scratch our letters with pen nibs, to count with beans and an abacus that had been a curiosity in the town for as long as anyone remembered, and to repeat with proud voices the lines of Camões that no one fully understood but everyone felt the weight of. Mestre Alvaro was younger than my father, with a tidy beard and a fondness for his students that was not always disguised by his sternness. He taught us to read and to write not just our names on registry papers but the names of the towns we would never see and the poems of people long dead who could still manage to disturb the heart of a boy perched on a bench in a sunlit room at the edge of Portugal. We were not so far from the larger town, where there was a market every Wednesday and church every Sunday and a small, serious building where the administration handled birth registers and grain levies. News came up the road in the mouths of muleteers and in the wrinkled papers the regdor liked to wave, and sometimes we were visited by a blind man from the next valley who played the concertina and sang finds he called novidades, new things. There were talk of the telegraph, of lines that carried words faster than a man could move his legs. We did not believe it. The idea that words could travel ahead of a man felt disrespectful to words. I have told you all this because it is how the day of our silencing began, as any day begins with water, bread, school, work, the sound of a bell, the polite lies we tell one another to keep our days smooth. Had I known what would come, I might have listened even more closely, but I do not know if that would have helped. Knowledge often arrives too late to change anything but the way we tell the story. In 1855, 2 years before the year I speak of, the village had lost some of its oldest ones to an illness that came up the river like a fog and caught those whose breath was already thin. We were careful after that. My mother made decoctions of mint and lemon balm. Padre Sebastião persuaded us to boil our water, though he himself found it hard to remember. We washed more, we prayed more, we opened the windows when we could. The emptiness those elders left was a quietness of its own, lingering in doorways and in the way we waited an extra moment at the fountain as if expecting someone to arrive who had already left. Perhaps the wound of that was part of what made us ready to do what we did later. I don't know. That winter, the rains came early and left early. The fields were patchwork, plots of wheat green and then yellow, plots of vines that seemed to hold their breath, olive groves that would give fruit no matter what you begged or cursed. We carried water from the fountain in buckets to pour at the roots of our fig trees. The women closed the shutters in the heat of the afternoon and fed the cool fires that bake our bread. The men did their work and shook their heads at the sky and said little. We were never a village of many words. People in the towns thought us reserved, people from the hills thought us talkative. That is always the case, we think ourselves the standard by which others are measured, and they think the same of us. One morning in early spring, a clerk came from the administrative office in the town, riding a donkey that seemed sullen about its job. He dismounted in the square and wiped his brow with a handkerchief, though the day was not yet hot. He wore a jacket too fine for the dust and a hat that sat too high on his head. His boots were good leather. When he straightened himself, he had the air of a person who carries an errand from those who do not care to get their own boots dirty. He nodded to the rector with a familiarity that tightened the skin around the older man's eyes. "Tidings," he said, and showed the rector an official document with a ribbon. "His Excellency, the chief administrator of the district, sends his regards and the joyous news that the Crown has approved the road improvements to better unite our proud kingdom." "From the town to where?" asked the rector, though we all knew what was implied. The crude road along which we hauled our goods needed smoothing, and there had been talk of a new road that would swing through the valley, cutting across some fields and snaking down to the broader road at the river. The men were not opposed to improvements, as a rule. But we resist most what we did not ask for, even if it might do us good. "Why, from the town to the coast, and beyond," the clerk said, with a flourish of his hand. "It will pass right through your agreeable square here, and then down, hugging the olive press. Ah, Senor," he nodded at Senor Fialho, who had come to see what the fuss was about, "no need to fret, there will be compensation if the stone wall must be moved. Turn along the old barn of Senor Pires, and cross the stream." "But the fountain," said one of the older women, Maria de Luz, her voice calm and tight as string that has been pulled too often, "the fountain will be in the road." The clerk glanced at the stone face that poured our water and shrugged. "It will be moved, woman. Would you halt progress for a trough?" "It has a name," she said, and something in her face made the rector lift his hand as if to quiet something that had not yet begun to speak. "We will meet," he said, calming, "always the mediator. The village will meet. We will discuss the route and the matters of stone and compensation. We will do it properly." "That is very reasonable," the clerk said, eager to have accomplished his errand. I will leave this with you. The surveyor will be along, in due course, to mark. He is an excellent fellow, precise. The Crown is most enthusiastic about roads. Men are often enthusiastic about roads, I have learned, when they themselves do not intend to walk them under a sack of wheat in August. The regner took the paper and the clerk took his donkey back on the road, and we stood in the square and looked at the fountain as if it were already gone. It can be rebuilt, my father said, soft enough that only I heard. Water flows where it finds the easiest path. My grandmother, who had been shelling peas at the fountain ledge, lifted her head. Water, yes, she said. But men's hearts get stuck. We had a meeting, of course, as the regner had said we would. It was in the schoolhouse because it was the only building where all of us could crowd without standing under rain or stars. The benches were moved to the corners, and the men stood at the front and argued with courtesy, which is to say, each man exposed his own reason as if it were the only reason and then attempted to sew all the others into his way of seeing. The women stood along the walls with their hands on the backs of children and said their opinions in the way women do, by looking at one another and shaking their heads or lifting their chins and pressing their lips together. I sat next to Miguel, who had a way of hearing everything and then making a face that told you exactly how much of it he believed. We could turn the road here, said Señor Pires, who owned the old barn, drawing a line in the air with his finger. We could, said my father, but then it would cut through Antonio's field. Antonio said he did not mind. Others said of course he would say that, as he always wanted to show himself generous. The schoolmaster suggested the road might go below the olive press. Señor Fialho said it would ruin the drainage. All of this was done with the careful voices of men who must live next to one another for the rest of their lives and who know that a harsh word leaves a cicatrice, a scar, as lasting as a plowed furrow. It has been decided, the regner concluded, when the moon had risen and we had said very little that we had not already said. But we can request changes. We will request that the fountain be moved only when another supply is secured. We will request the surveyor's patience. We will offer to work, as we always do, to ease their labor. And when they say no, ask my grandmother, not unkindly. Then we will do as we can. He folded the document in a careful way, as if the folds could hide the content. Life went on. That is one of life's quietest miracles, that things continue in the lanes of their habits while a change is gathering just beyond the hedges. The morning after the meeting, my mother kneaded bread again and I carried water again and my father planed another board. I accompanied Miguel to the riverbank and we launched leaves as boats and made wagers about which leaf would reach the low bridge first. Rosa, who lived near the school and had braids that distracted me in a way I did not wish to consider, returned from the well with her bucket and glanced at us with a small smile. She was a year older than me, which in village years meant she might as well have been as far away as Brazil. She walked with her shoulders straight and her chin lifted and did not seem to care if anyone watched her. The first time I understood that girls were more than the useful creatures who fetched water faster than boys and sang the harvest songs, it was because I watched Rosa knot a scarf and felt something turn over in me, as if recognizing a pattern it had always known. "Do not stare like a calf," Miguel whispered, elbowing me. I was not. I rubbed my elbow. I was thinking about the road. "Ah," he said, the way he said everything, with an amused curl of the mouth. "Everyone is. They say it will bring carriages with strangers, people from the city, with their hats. You will talk to them with your tongue too quick, and they will carry our stories back and sell them at market. Why would anyone pay for such stories?" I asked. "Because the city folk have lost all their own. We had been told that in Lisbon the first train had run a year ago, and though my father had been to Lisbon when he was young to see, only to see, no desire to stay, he would say he did not believe in these things, not because they were impossible, but because they were unnecessary to him. The world he loved was the one his hands touched every day, and any contrivance that did not improve the relationship between hand and wood was a small nuisance to be ignored. "There are too many words on paper," he said once. "I like words that smell like sawdust." There were too many words on paper about the road, it is true. The surveyor came along on a pale donkey with a measuring pole and a string and a complicated device he set on a tripod and stared through at the horizon. He was polite enough, and spoke of other things while he worked, and his eyes had the tired, friendly squint of someone who has heard too much from too many kinds of people. He marked the ground with pegs and blue chalk, and then he drew a line with a stick through air, and on that air line our lives rearranged themselves without our consent. "That is where the trench will be," he explained. "There, the new stonework. You will be proud of it?" "We are proud already," said Senor Pires, folding his arms. But he smiled, because he was a man who liked to be seen smiling. The day the surveyor's line passed through the place where the fountain stood, all of us who could found a reason to be there. The school let out early. The olive press paused. The women came with their baskets, invisibly daring anyone to hustle them away. The rector stood very straight. The surveyor, watching us watch him, took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. He was not a cruel man, and I think he wished he could move the earth with his hand to avoid our faces. He said, "We can set a new fountain lower. The spring can be tapped again." My grandmother moved toward the stone face. "This is not a bucket with a hole," she said. "This is where my mother laughed and my father washed his hands after coming from the field, and where my children pulled at my skirt, and where I set down my basket when I could not carry it any more. This is where my husband put his hand on the stone and rested his head without saying a word in front of all of you when our child died. It is not a trough. It is where our lives are." The surveyor looked at the rector. The rector cleared his throat. The surveyor did not mark the stone. He marked the place beside it and mumbled something about adjustments, and we breathed out, a little, the breath that had been held in for days. That night the wind came from the sea, bringing the smell of fish and the heavy, salted dusk. I lay on my back in our small room and stared at the peeling plaster of the ceiling, and I listened to my sister breathing and my father turning over carefully on his mattress because his back was paining him, and the slight murmurs of my mother's dreams. The silence was not empty. It was full of these things, and of the fountain speaking in its secret language, and the slow, different tick of the clock in the schoolhouse. I thought of what my grandmother had said, "God hears the weight of our feet." I thought of the surveyor's lined eyes. I thought of the train that ran without horses. I fell asleep wondering what it would say to lay my cheek against a window and see the world race past faster than a man could run. I woke to the clatter of spoons and to my mother's fussing in the kitchen, and then to my father's quiet voice that could sound like music to me when he chose to use it. "Eat, Tomasz," my mother said. "You will be late for lessons." I was not late, I rarely was. I liked school, though I pretended not to. That day, Mestre Alvaro had laid out a row of books on the front table, books with worn leather and a smell that was a mixture of ink, glue, and time. He had received them from a cousin in Porto. There was a book of geography with a drawing of a train that looked like a kettle with wheels. There was a book of poems whose verses felt like a river when read aloud. There was a book of advice to the curious, in which I discovered an illustration of something that looked like a spider and which the caption declared was a telegraph, a machine that carried messages in little clicks along wires. I did not believe it, not then, simply because I did not understand how anything so simple could do something so miraculous. It was something like the fountain, it seemed to me, dry stone providing water, wire carrying words. How could the stone do that? How could the wire? Tomasz, the schoolmaster said when he found me studying the drawing while the others solved problems with beans, you are staring at an image. Yes, I said. What do you see? Something that looks like a toy and a spider held together with screws. He laughed. Do you know what it is? It says it is a telegraph. It says it talks without air. He nodded. And do you think it can? Yes, I said, surprising myself. If men can persuade water to climb stone, they can persuade words to travel wire. You will be a poet, not a carpenter, he said. Do not tell your father I said it. He already knows, I said. He thinks it ridiculous. Poetry always seems ridiculous to those who build boats, the schoolmaster said, more softly. So much of it sinks. How do you know? I asked. I have taught many boys who wanted to be sailors and many who wanted to be priests and a few who wanted to be poets and one who wanted to be a vigilance officer for the king. All those boats sailed, except for the poems. They foundered at life. What about yours? I asked, instantly curious, for he had told me without meaning to that he had written them, and now I wanted to know everything about him that he had never said. He smiled, shaking his head. Even teachers have their secrets, Tomasz. Then he nodded at the page of sums regarding the price of wheat and the number of sacks a man could carry and how many days in a month could be spent between field and festival. Return to the world of beans. The day the road builders arrived, it was the end of April and the first swallows had begun to trace their loops above the river. The men who came were not from our village but from the town, with ropes and picks and trowels. They were not rough men, not rude, they nodded and touched the brims of their hats. But they had a job to do, and because they did not live in Vale des Ambros, our regret did not slow them. They set up their tools by the old barn and measured and struck the ground with stakes. They had with them an overseer with a leather belt that hung with instruments my father glanced at and then looked away from, because knowledge that comes from an instrument is a knowledge he did not trust entirely. Knowledge that comes from the hand was his preference. He ran his palm along a plank and could tell you where it would flex. He placed his hand on the hull of a boat, and by the temperature of the wood he knew if the caulking had sealed. He placed his hand on my head when I was feverish and knew what the fever intended. He had that gift. It made me love him even when he scolded me for leaving the plane on the bench with its blade up. The men set to work along the surveyor's line. They began near the barn, and then they came toward the square. When they reached the place where the fountain stepped out from the wall, they did what men always do when they encounter something that interrupts a straight line, they postponed it. They worked around, they cut elsewhere, they moved stones elsewhere, while one of them rubbed a thumb beneath his lower lip and looked at the fountain as if he were considering giving up smoking. Our fountain sang its soft song and pretended not to notice the anxiety it generated. Perhaps they won't move it, I whispered to Miguel, who had come to stand beside me under the plane tree. I had no right to speak of hope. I had not earned it. But I said it because, like my grandmother said, words can become pebbles that keep you walking, even if they do not change your destination. They will, he said, because he had no use for such pebbles. We could build another. It would not be the same. Nothing is ever exactly the same, he said, not unkindly. He was right. But one owes one's youth an attempt to believe the opposite. Some events in a life feel like a single thing, though they are made up of many small pieces that only after the fact become a whole. The trench they dug for the road came closer each day, and each day my grandmother sat by the fountain and shelled beans, and each day the men deferred the decision by digging elsewhere. The rector wrote letters. The administrative office responded with letters that said we understood but progress, and we appreciate your cooperation, and the Crown's outlay will be repaid in prosperity. The letters were always polite and often wrong. I watched Rosa wash her hands at the fountain and saw in the way she lifted her fingers that she too understood, without perhaps having formed the thought into words, that certain places hold a community's soul better than any building. The fountain was where the women taught the younger ones to wash clothes without bruising the knuckles. It was where the men cooled their wrists after a day in the field. It was where strangers could draw away their thirst without having asked anyone, and still receive more hospitality than if they had knocked on a door. It was, in a word, ours. Perhaps all that was needed was a word from the right person at the right time. I say this not to blame but to honor the power of a voice, which we would learn to lay down. On the day the overseer set a red chalk mark on the stone just to the right of the fountain to indicate the limit, he assured us, no need to worry, no one will move until the pipes are prepared. My grandmother stood and laid down her bag of peas. She walked to the stone face and touched the carved cheek with a hand that had tended births and kneaded bread and stitched torn shirts and carried children's rough laughter. She did not speak. She was not a woman to make a speech. She simply stood, and the quiet around her felt of the kind I had only known in church. The overseer, who was not unkind, took his hat off and held it in his hands. We will do as gently as can be done, he said. No one wishes to break your stone, Senora. She nodded once, a slight bow of the head that felt like both acceptance and denial, and returned to her bench. She continued to shell her peas. I counted the peas falling into her bowl. It is odd what one does with one's heart when driven into a corner, it often becomes a mill. The turning, when it came, was not an argument, though it has been remembered by some as a quarrel. Men always remember words thrown in the air more than the weight that pressed them out. If there was a knot of displeasure in us and there was it unwound in a different shape. It was a Sunday, one of those mornings when after Mass the light falls in a particular way on the door of the chapel, making us feel both beautiful and temporary. The sermon had been about the man in Scripture who lost his speech for a time and learned to treasure it. Padre Sebastião, who was not in the habit of hinting, seemed to be warning us of something, though I do not know if he knew what. After Mass, we formed our usual small circles in the square, the men in one, the women in another, the children making a third that flickered between the two like a school of fish darting between rock and sunlight. The clerk from the town came, not with documents, but with a strut. He was pleased with himself, as some men are on good days. He spoke of the road to those who would listen, and then he set his palm on the fountain stone and gave a little, thoughtless rap with his knuckles, the way men do with things they have never had to lift. Your days of delay are counted, he said in a cheerful voice. We will be here tomorrow with the foreman and the plan for replacing the fountain. You will see how efficient. Before he could say the word, my grandmother put her hand on his. She touched him lightly, for she was not a woman to touch anyone in a way that would cause embarrassment, but her hand had the weight of something heavier than flesh, and the clerk's mouth closed shut as if a gloved hand had touched it. She did not look angry. She looked worn in the way a good tool looks when it has been used for the job it was meant to do. She looked at him and shook her head, very slowly, the way one does when bringing one stubborn child back into the house from the rain. He was not humiliated. He was not threatened. he was only stopped for a breath as one is stopped by the unexpected small dignity of another's need. He withdrew his hand. He cleared his throat. He started to say, "Madam," the word died again, not because anyone forced it, but because he saw that in this matter, words were clumsy and we were not ready to have them on us. "I will return in the morning," he said, finally, and tipped his hat and left across the square, and if there was a bit of red in his face, it was not from anger. It was from being a man reminded by the world of the limits of the word efficient. We stood then. We stood a long while. The sound of wind through the plane tree, the water at the fountain, and the hoofbeats of the clerk's donkey dwindling on the road were the only sounds. My grandmother resumed her place on the bench. She lifted her bowl of peas and put it in my lap. She touched my cheek with her dry hand, and then she pressed her fingers to my lips. It was a gesture she had used with me when I was small and crying, a way of reminding me where my breath could be found. It was only then that I understood something had changed. "Avu," I said, or tried to. The word was stopped by her touch, not over my lips now, but over my heart. She held her hand there gently for a moment, and the warmth of her palm met the quickness of my heartbeat and made a new thing between us. Then she smiled and withdrew her hand and returned to the fountain. I glanced at my mother. She nodded, strangely calm. My father's face was thoughtful. Ines looked uncertain, and then she put her little finger to her own lips in imitation of our grandmother and smiled with the satisfaction of a little girl who believes she understands. I thought it was only a game at first. After all, the women of Vale des Ambroise were fond of small experiments, fasting before a feast to make the feast taste more of abundance, saving a spool of thread just to see how far it would go, laying a fabric in the sun to bless it with color before cutting. A small silence, I thought, to remind our words to behave. It was not a game. That afternoon, when the muleteer came up the road with salt to deliver and called out, "Anybody there?" we stood in the square and smiled at him, and no one shouted back, "Leave it by the press." My father stepped forward and pointed. The muleteer laughed, thinking it a lark, and set the sack by the press. "Tired today?" he asked me, teasing. I grinned and wished with all my heart for words. Then I stopped myself. That was when I knew that I do not know how to describe it, except to say that a hush had been passed from my grandmother's hand into my chest. The tavern in the next village would later tell the story differently, as taverns must, that it had been the rector who had declared we would not speak until the road plans were changed. Or perhaps they would say the priest had forbidden speech as a form of protest, which clergy love. There are many ways to tell a story,